All right, today's topic is, whoops, oh yeah, right, there we go. Okay, lecture 12, cities and regions, or subnational geographies. So, and I have this really weird PowerPoint format called thumbtacks, or whatever, pushpins, really bizarre, which of course brings to mind the death of Steve Jobs, which when you talk about technology and modern capitalism, he is the god. And I imagine over the next several decades, he will play a kind of equivalent role to Henry Ford in the 20th century as this iconic figure in industrial history. And I guess you could say he was brilliant at design and also brilliant at systems. We talked about production systems, but of course what he was best at was putting together consumer product systems that worked. Because as I also told you, we like to take our services as commodities. We like products. We want all our electronics in a box. That's really easy to use, and he understood that. And that was his genius. So it's no big loss for electronics and that world, but capitalism will soldier on. So, lecture 12, cities and regions. So our keys today are subnational economies matter. They matter because national economies are not even. They have very different regional levels of development. So they have a very interesting internal economic geographies to countries. We can't just treat countries as of a piece. And cities, of course, are particularly crucial because they are really the heartlands of capitalism. So we talked about national state and the birth of capitalism. You can make the same argument about cities, and I will. Cities and regions are sort of underappreciated, certainly in conventional economics. They're almost never mentioned. There is a recent book out by Edward Glaser, an MIT economist, about what makes cities work, which is based on conventional neoclassical principles. And while Ed Glaser's a nice guy and a smart guy, I don't think it works, because a lot of it's based on the idea of amenities. We go to cities for amenities, not because of their role as production centers and centers of commerce and finance, which is really the big reason why cities exist. But cities and regions, they're these funny kind of unbounded units. They don't have national governments as a rule to run up flags that you salute. You don't salute to the city of Berkeley or San Francisco. So they have much less impact, much less presence. But they have absolutely crucial effects, not only economically, but socially and politically. So we'll mention those along the way. And cities themselves are now megacities, metro cities. We have these megacities around the world, 20 to 30 million people now. Cities just keep getting bigger. And they're very complex economies, often like miniature national economies. And the systems of cities are indeed the sort of arterials of world capitalism. So we always think in terms of nations and international trade, but a lot of this stuff is connections along the links between cities across borders around the world, and always has been. So let's break that out. We'll talk about regions and then cities and then networks of cities and regions. So talk about regions. I think I got this. I do the same categories on cities: territory, economy, society, and politics. Okay. Well, what is a region? Regions, the word is tossed around. We often hear something like the Latin American region. Well, I'm using it as subnational. There are uses of it transnational, but then I use the word continental to try to differentiate. So it gets a pretty slapdash usage of anything that doesn't have a border around it. A region tends to be open. You can get like maps like this, somebody discussing U.S. history in terms of the southern region, the industrial area, New England, the Midwest and Great Plains. I like how the Mountain West is the empty quarter. And what is the Pacific? Ecotopia. This is a really silly map. But here's one of California, and we do think of California often in terms of regions, geographic regions, and so on, which makes some sense. In many ways, crossing the Tehachapi's matter, going into the Central Valley matters, and so on. Now, some of that is based, as old-timey geographers like to point out, on nature and river basins. The Central Valley is a big agricultural area because it's a big, flat, relatively flat area, well-watered, hot, and very good for growing. But, of course, it's also because it's agricultural, that it's different from Silicon Valley. It's a very different industry, a very different outlook on the world, on life, and so on. And these regions hold together because they have some kind of natural territorial bases. The Northwest, we talk easily about the Pacific Northwest, or the Southwest because of the commonalities of climate, topography, even rainfall, forest. You come from the Northwest and you're used to forest. Of course, that ignores the part east of the Cascades that is as dry and drier than the Bay Area. But mostly you have things like politics and cultural differences. The long difference between New England culture, New England settlement, and Southern settlement, for example, makes those very different regions, as I'll come back to. And they get unified. Regions get unified partly by economic processes of integration, partly by social processes, I guess I could put in there. You start to sort of live in California, think as a Californian. You say, oh, yeah, I'm from California. And the fact, then there's political unification, because in a federalist state like the U.S., California actually has a boundary, it has a government, so it's more than just a regional concept, whereas the South, except for the Civil War, doesn't have a unified government. It's a series of states. If you're from the northern Rockies, you may feel you're from a very distinctive region, but it's vaguely Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and so on. So regions are hard to pin down, and that's why they're kind of a slippery concept, but that doesn't mean they don't exist, that they don't have economic or social or political integrity in certain ways. As the nation state arose, nation states replaced different kind of territorial systems of either earlier empires or feudal suzerainties, kingships, or ducal systems, or in the case of Italy, a combination of city-states and papal states with a long history of their own going back through feudalism and even beyond. So in the case of Italy, the nation state unified a bunch of city-states, ducal states, papal states into a modern nation state. People still have a lot of allegiances to their region in Italy. It's an extremely regionalized country with regional dialects, regional identifications, and so on. In the UK, of course, the United Kingdom is brought about by the conquest of Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, bringing them under the suzerainty of England, and then calling it the United Kingdom. And, of course, a lot of those people weren't too happy about it. But even the USA, we were the confederation of states of these colonies that had separate histories. So we have been, of course, integrated for a long time under one country, but as you all know, there was this little blip, and not so little blip, of the Civil War. But by and large, nation-states subordinate these old regions, subordinate regional economies and regional cultures, and bring them into a political unity where you all have the same governmental system, you all have the same school system. We talked about this when I talked about nationalism. And you use national symbols and national rah-rah to try and get people to all say, I'm an American. But I'm a Californian. I'm a Bay Arean. A Berkeleyan. And sometimes I feel much more affinity for the small areas than I do for that big one. Why should I identify with America, per se? Why should I identify with Florida? A good question, right? Kind of a good question. You giggle. I know, but sometimes we're all supposed to say, well, we're Americans. What does that mean? Okay, and indeed, in some countries, like the U.S., we recognize from the get-go that there were these regional differences, and even autonomy of the U.S. colonies, for example, which gets written into a federalist constitution. So we're a federalist state that combines these many states which have a certain subnational sovereignty and autonomy, but it's limited, of course, and we have battles over just how limited it is. That's been defined historically through legal cases and all kinds of whoop-de-doo. Canada is also a federal state. Are you taking notes back there? You, in the white shirt, are you taking notes? Yeah, you are. Okay, because you look very focused. Yeah, okay, no, you look very focused. I did ask people who have computers trying to sit in the front, okay? Germany is now a federal state. Then there's sort of semi-federal. Mexico and China. Mexico is it is called the United States of Mexico. States do have governors and legislators and so on, although it's more centralized in the United States, historically, and less today than it was in the past. China has devolved a lot of power to its provinces and to municipalities. It's much more of a federalist state now, even though it's spoken of often as a unified nation. So these things are fuzzy. They're open to interpretation, reinterpretation, and indeed in practice and also by academics. And there are states that have devolved, that were more unified, that have become less unified. I could, of course, put China under that, but more dramatic examples are Spain, which has had to give a lot of autonomy to areas like Galicia and Catalonia and the Basque Country because of rebel movements and desires for regional autonomy. Britain now, Scotland has its own parliament. Doesn't have its own foreign policy, but it has its own parliament. And there's some talk that Scotland will break away. There are books written called The Breakup of Britain and things like that. Whereas in France and Germany, there's no state or province that's trying to break away. And then there are other countries that fall apart completely. We'll come back to that. Some states are highly centralized. Japan and France are good examples. The new Russia is a good example, which is really the old Russia. Economy, regions develop unevenly. They have different economic bases, and they have more advanced and less advanced histories of capitalism. China is extremely uneven. The East Coast is where most of the activity is that we all talk about. The center and the West is extremely poor and backward. We have in the United States, California was always the most developed part of the Great West of the United States and lorded it over a lot of the territory all the way east of the Rockies. In Mexico, traditionally, the great developed center was the Valley of Mexico, Mexico City. The northern states and southern states were much less developed than the center. We'll see that that's changed. But you can't talk about national geographies, economic geographies, without recognizing this unevenness. It's both historical and it's constantly changing. With regional industrialization, Mexico has undergone a huge change. The north has been where all the maquiladoras are. The most rapid industrialization has been in the north, the border zone. By the 1990s, there was 1 million new jobs, and now you have a kind of balance, much more of a balance between the far north and Mexico City. And also a lot of urbanization in the north. Huge cities like Tijuana. Was Tijuana 2 million people now? I mean, Mexico City is 25, but still, you put all the northern cities together, and they add up to, 10 million, maybe a little more. Southern China was the area of initial regional industrialization under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, and took off in the 1980s. Those cities in southern China around the Pearl River Delta grew very rapidly, and then for political and other reasons, the action shifted more back north to Shanghai region and to Beijing at the expense. But the southern ones were chosen primarily because they were near Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, China wanted to absorb Hong Kong. Hong Kong wanted relations, wanted to invest in China, and Hong Kong was a huge commercial center with a lot of money. So they wanted to take advantage of that. Regional economies can look like mini national economies. A big region like Guangdong or the Shanghai region is extremely complex, a mix of industry and commerce and finance and so on. And generally, some of the biggest regions, if you think of something like the Great Industrial Belt, or even think of California in the United States. This is one of the biggest economies in the world. It's in the top 10. It has an awful large, it has a huge mix of activities of everything that you can think of is probably made somewhere in California. There's very little that isn't made here, or bought here, or sold here, traded here, so on. And this would be true of a lot of major regions like the Paris region in France, or the Hesse, southern Rhine region of Germany. However, generally regions aren't as big as national economies. They're certainly as big regions like the regions of China. The provinces of China are bigger than a lot of countries. And they have economies that are bigger than a lot of countries and more complex. People love to draw these kind of maps. They're kind of fun, showing the provinces compared to national economies. That, I don't know where's, let's see, Fujian is probably here. It's the size of Ireland. And so on. Guangdong is the size of Indonesia. Yunnan is the size of Vietnam in output, which isn't very big. And so on. And so they compare that. I don't know what that tells you, actually. But it tells you that Libya is really poor because Xinjiang is very poor, too. And they both, by the way, have lots of Muslims and aren't Han Chinese. So, provinces, most big countries do well because they have a lot of different provinces with different specialties that can trade internally. That makes those countries more stable, less exposed to one thing. Like if you're El Salvador, what have you got? Some sewing work, coffee, bananas, a lot of drugs. Right? And it's not a very robust economy, and it's an economy that's much more open to the vagaries of prices of primary goods, bananas, or whatever. Some regions are quite specialized. Like if you look at the high plains, western Midwest of the United States, it's a grain-growing, cattle-growing area, cattle-feeding, animal-feeding area. That's what this map is. It's actually in poultry, by the way, feeding them corn and fattening them up and slaughtering them and so on in that area. So it's highly specialized. Florida used to be highly specialized in retirement, but it's become a much more complicated community. Las Vegas, of course, and Nevada, specialized in gaming and sinning. So you get a spatial division of labor within a country, and with a huge country like the United States. Internal trade has always been much bigger than external trade. So all those Ricardian things about international trade could be said about internal trade. And you know the story of the certain kinds of specializations we have. oil in Texas and Louisiana, for example, high tech in Silicon Valley in California, and so on. And you can actually try to measure this. There's a system, empirical formula called location quotients. You can work out what percentage of the nation's, or how exaggerated is the presence of a certain industry in that area. And this is somebody who's done that, a geographer who's done that for electronics around the country to show how high the electronics the quotients are. Aerospace, electronics in California is very, very high location quotient. 1 is neutral. So all these areas, activities in California of electronics are highly concentrated here. But Massachusetts also has extremely high quotients, and some other states as well. Regions are actually, we tend to think of them as pretty bland and uninteresting, but there is some work, this is kind of a boring slide, but I did want to remind myself that there's some very interesting work about how the same technology in the same industry can actually be applied differently across different regions in the United States, which is a kind of unexpected result. You think of it as a very homogeneous country. Boy, industrially, we must be very homogeneous. Steel is steel is steel. But it turns out the technologies used in steel and electronics and so on in different regions actually vary for the same activity. They can be applied differently because of different regional traditions, regional mixes of the cost of labor, maybe distribution systems. I don't know. It's difficult to explain it, but it's interesting that it exists. The U.S. is also, despite what I just said, is less regionalized than Europe. Michael Storper's done some research on Europe versus the EU versus the United States. And as you might expect, Europe, given that it has a history of very small states, a lot of conflict between those states, is more regionalized, more differentiated than the United States. The United States has had 200 years of a constitutional integration, making us the world's biggest integrated market prior to the rise of the EU. So until the last 40 years or so, we would have been the biggest market space in the world. We have a lot of mobility of labor. We're very famous for the fact people will pick up and move at the drop of a hat, though they tend to not move as far as they actually mostly move within their region. But there's a lot of willingness still, higher than other countries, to move long distances, and so on. So, and the U.S. actually turns out has a higher level of innovation than Europe, and Storper explains this by saying, because labor and capital can rush to an area like Silicon Valley as it grows based on a new technology and a new industry. Whereas in Europe, people tend to stay put more. Now, the EU is trying to break that up and get more long-distance trade. So as London grew, really went through another boom, one of its infinite booms in finance in the last 20 years, London filled up with Europeans, young Europeans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France. There's 500,000 French people living in London because they came to be part of that banking and the rest of the London economy, although banking and finance is the biggest part of it. And they could move across borders without passports. And that allowed that boom to proceed. Okay, the society of regions, we tend again to think of regions and countries as homogeneous, but they are not. Because they are cobbled together, because they have different histories, often over very large territories, regions can be quite different. And they can have historic bases, differences of language and dress and food and so on. We still have restaurants like Pecan in Oakland that advertise Southern cooking. So that's a regional cuisine. I don't think anybody advertises New England cooking, but you do get things like Chicago pizza, genuine New York pizza, Brooklyn pizza, that sort of thing, based on that idea. Philly cheesesteak, based on certain, in that case, fairly trivial regional cultural differences. But there are more profound differences that go back to settlement and conquest, divisive wars, and so on. Bolivia is quite divided regionally, and over here in Santa Cruz is an area of ranching. It's much whiter. If you go up in the highlands here, you have native peoples, much poorer, much different economy. This is sort of agribusiness, and this has been very small holdings and a lot of poverty. And those two halves of Bolivia have been fighting like cats and dogs for a long time. And with a native-born president now, Morales, in Bolivia, those conflicts have sharpened. So, but you get very different economic cultures with different foundations. The South, quite apart from slavery, was more agrarian. The Midwest, more agrarian, especially the Plain States, more agrarian. The Upper Midwest, more industrial, and so on. California, the difference between the Central Valley and the Bay Area has to do with industry and urbanization versus agriculture, agribusiness, and so on. So those things matter. And you see differences in all kinds of stuff, size of property, size of business, and kinds of workers that they're employed, out of which you get class differences. So you have big landed class in Santa Cruz, and you have peasants in the highlands. You have more communal organization in the highlands and more wide open capitalism and wage labor in the lowlands in the east. Those things make profound differences in the allegiances of people, the prosperity of the region, and so on. And they can't just be attributed to culture. It has to do with economic foundations of who owns property, how is business organized, what kind of development history you've had. And of course, the southern U.S., you had cotton, slavery, and a very distinctive property and economic system all the way up for 300 years. Or 200, well, really a full blast, 200 years, and that made the South quite different, and the North eventually came to blows over that. Europe has that history of fragmentation more than we do in any of the Americas. We've had bigger, more united countries in many ways in the Americas. And what the EU did, interestingly enough, is try to overcome that sort of national autonomy, nationalism, because it's trying to break that down, right? It's trying to get those countries to stop fighting each other. So the EU has systematically had a regional policy to favor subnational regions, to pump money into places like Galicia, or the Basque Country, or into the old northern part of England, the old industrial north of England. They have all these policies like having showcase cities. They put a lot of money into some relatively obscure city that'll be the annual city of culture in Europe or something. And Europeans, as a result of this, there's a very rich literature in Europe now about the regions, the world of the regions, Europe of the regions. Whereas in the United States, we used to have a literature. Frederick Jackson Turner not only wrote about the frontier, he wrote about sectionalism or regionalism. We have a long history of things like New England history, Western history, Southern history. Mostly we've ignored it, except for a few people in New England, a lot of people in the South. And people in California